Think about writing as sort of like a long cooking, simmering stew. You just don't know what's going to eventually bubble up out of that stew. Don't throw away ideas.
Welcome to a special edition of All About Jack, a podcast feature of EssentialCSLewis.com. I'm William O'Flaherty, author of C.S. Lewis Goes to Hell, a companion and study guide to the Screwtape Letters. What I have for you today is a two-person panel discussion that I moderated back at the end of March 2017. My guests were Dr. Hal Poe and Dr. Don King. The conversation I had with them was part of the Creative Writing Festival for high school students that took place at Montreat College. That event was held before the Inklings Fellowship Weekend Retreat that began that Friday evening on March 31st. The focus, as you might guess, was on writing, of course, but more specifically it was about C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien as writers and what we can learn from them. The beginning part of the original session contained mostly introductory information about Lewis and Tolkien. Because the majority of you who listen to All About Jack are familiar with these basics, I'm skipping it initially and sharing the main discussion with Dr. Don King and Dr. Hal Poe, where we explore what drove these famous authors to write and what one can learn from their unique strengths to become better writers, among other related topics. However, because there could be some less familiar with either Lewis or Tolkien, I am putting those beginning remarks just after this main content, as there were also some details not as commonly known, and there were some tie-ins to their writing. Finally, then, the end of the session will be, well, at the end. Why did each of these writers write? In other words, what drove them to write? And we'll start off with you, Don.
A lot of writers say that they write because they have to write. Maybe some of you feel that way. I've never quite been satisfied with that as an answer for why people write. I think in the case of Lewis, he wrote because writing for him was like, if you have a passion, like if you have a sport that you're passionate about, soccer, or if you like to knit, or if you like to play golf, or anything that you have a passion for, people don't have to make you do it. You do it because you love to do it. And I think that's the case of C.S. Lewis. He loved to write. I think he was also born to write. Maybe other people are born to write, but Lewis loved to write. He once said that he had an addiction to ink, and he wrote with the old nib pen that you would dip into the little cup that would have ink in it, and he would write with that nib pen. So I think Lewis, he loved to write, and it just was a full expression of his personality. Another reason that he wrote was, he says in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, is that he was physically clumsy. He and his brother, Warren, had a physical defect. They could not take their thumb and bend it like that. So their thumb was not very flexible. It's kind of hard to play sports, especially if you're trying to handle a ball and you can't move your thumb. So Lewis said because of that handicap, he was driven to write stories. He initially tried to make castles and so forth using paper and scissors, but he even couldn't use his scissors very effectively. So he said instead of sort of constructing stories, if you will, he wrote stories. And he said he didn't realize what a wealth of delight that handicap, if you will, gave him in terms of forcing him to become a writer.
Tolkien was a bit different. In some respects, he liked stories, but the stories he liked tended to be the old oral sagas of the Norse people that were eventually written down. But he liked language generally. In fact, that was his real study as a scholar, not the stories themselves, but the development of the language and how language changed. And he made up his own languages, but once he'd made up the languages, he needed to have a place for the languages to happen. And so his storytelling provided a context for Elvish and Dwarfish and Orc and all of these different languages to take place, and the stories sort of gave life to the languages. And he really wasn't interested in publishing his stories. He did them for his own amusement. He had his own little world, and it was very private, for fear people might think he was crazy. And only a few people knew about it. Lewis was one of the few who knew that he had constructed this entire world for his own interest and in a way of solving some problems of how language works that was applied to his teaching of how the English language changed from Old English to Middle English. And modern English really didn't interest him. He didn't like modern literature after Chaucer. So he just liked the real literature. And so he was animated by different interests, and publishing was not part of it. There's a saying in the United States, in the academic world, you publish or perish. And the way to get promoted really from assistant professor to associate professor to full professor is to publish articles and books. And Tolkien did not have to do that because he already had his professorship. He could have just coasted through life as many Oxford professors did at that time. And so it was pretty much a private exercise for him. And Lewis was the one who persuaded him to publish The Hobbit. And The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings were just little side features of his big work, which was the Silmarillion. And this is the entire history of Middle-earth from its creation. And he never finished it. And his son was the one who finally edited the edition that has been published. But it was largely just the love of language and how language expresses itself.
Next, we want to consider the strengths of each writer. That is, what does each do really well in their writing? We'll go to Don here first. One of the things you noted in your last response, I'm not sure if you were going to wait and follow up here, but you were noting that Lewis dipped his, he literally dipped a pen in ink and wrote. And there's something that may be obvious. That doesn't allow you to write very much before you have to pause and think. And is that one of the strengths of Lewis as a writer?
Well, I think that's we could almost call it sort of the mechanical process that he went through. That moment where you would have to dip back into the inkwell maybe gave him just that split second in his imagination to go forward. So I think that really is an interesting thing to think about. If you look at his manuscripts, and if you some of you, I believe, will go on to become scholars. You'll go to the Bodleian Library in Oxford, which is one of the oldest libraries in the world, and you can examine Lewis's original manuscripts there, and you can see where the pen begins to get fainter, and then it would get darker when he would dip it in. And I think that little split second perhaps was a way in which Lewis could think ahead. I think Lewis's strengths as a writer are many. Perhaps one of the most obvious are the many different genres that he wrote in. Again, if you look at that handout I gave you, look at the various kinds of things Lewis wrote. He wrote poetry, he wrote essays, he wrote literary criticism, he wrote Christian apologetics, he wrote science fiction, he wrote fantasy literature, he wrote realistic novels. He was also, as we know, a lecturer. He was good as a debater. And probably, according to his literary executor, Walter Hooper, Lewis probably wrote between 10 and 14,000 letters in his life. And letter writing, as many of us know, is sort of a lost art where we do email and texts now. By the way, this is a footnote. Those of you that will become biographers and you want to write about, say, a famous person that is living right now, maybe in 10 years you want to write that biography, I think you may be at an incredible disadvantage because there won't be any hard copies of those texts and those emails around unless the person you're writing about was so vain as to make a copy every time he or she sent off an email. So letters are incredibly, I think letters are incredibly valuable in terms of finding out something about a writer's life. And most of Lewis's letters, not all of them, and I think most of Tolkien's letters have been published. So if you really want to get to know about the life of Lewis or Tolkien, read their letters, just incredible insights. Lewis was also, as a writer, he was very lucid. He was very clear. He used language effectively. Just another sort of an example of the kind of preparation that he would go through in order to write something. Look at that handout, the book that he wrote as a part of the Oxford History of the English Language series, 16th century literature excluding drama. Lewis spent 10 years preparing to write that book. He read everything written in England, Ireland, Scotland, and Wales in the 16th century in the original language. It became something of a burden for him. As I said there, you can see Oxford. It was written as a part of the Oxford History of the English Language. So he would refer to the book when he was writing to his friends or speaking with his friends as the "Oh Hell" book, because it was so all-consuming. So I'll pass to.
They're almost opposites in terms of how they write. And oddly enough, you can see it on how they took hikes. They liked to walk. They would have loved living here, all the different places you can hike. But when Lewis went walking, he would charge forth at a rapid pace, and he loved the grand vistas, the huge landscapes. Tolkien, on the other hand, would dawdle along the way and look at all the little plants and the little rocks and the little twigs and the spider webs and all the details. And it was maddening to Lewis, who wanted to get on with the walk, whereas Tolkien was just driving him crazy by looking at all the details. Now compare The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe with The Fellowship of the Ring. And there's a difference in their approach to writing fiction. The Chronicles of Narnia were quickly written. Each volume was written in just a few, in some cases, weeks, but none of them more than a few months. Whereas The Lord of the Rings took about, 12 years to write, and stopping and starting and redoing it. At one point, Tolkien stopped. He was, 2/3 of the way through the Lord of the Rings, and he stopped and put it on the shelf because the moon was out of sequence. And so he had to go back and rewrite the whole thing to get the phase of the moon right for the action of the story. So he was paying enormous attention to detail, and he didn't like the Chronicles of Narnia. Tolkien despised the Chronicles of Narnia because Lewis had Father Christmas and fauns and all sorts of mythological beings from a variety of different cultures all in one story. And he said, "You can't do that." And Lewis laughed and said, "Of course, I've already done it." So they had different attitudes about writing, different styles of writing. And then it flips when we go to their scholarship. Tolkien did not do very much as a scholar. He would do a little preface, he would do a little appendix, a little vocabulary, a few short articles, but he really contributed very little scholarship. Lewis, on the other hand, wrote these massive works that are still in print. His Allegory of Love, which is a study of medieval allegorical courtly love poetry from the 11th century up until, the time of Shakespeare, Edmund Spenser's The Faerie Queene. Took him 10 years to write. And it isn't just everything that was written in the 16th century. He had to read everything that had been written from the time of Virgil forward to describe how culture changed. So in his scholarship, Lewis was highly detailed and thorough in his work. But his radio broadcasts He didn't think he was writing for the future. It was just a little quick 15-minute segment on the BBC, and it wouldn't be heard again, but it was published, and it wound up being Mere Christianity, still in print. And so different styles, not just different genre, different styles of writing. And as you think about your own writing, there is popular writing, there's professional writing, there's scholarly writing, and then you divide it up into subject matter, genre, and age group. What is the audience like that you're writing for? And as you write, you want to have in mind your audience. And Lewis was very good at gauging different books and articles to an audience. Tolkien wrote for himself. And The Lord of the Rings is monumental. You know, it's for the ages.
One quick fact check. Lewis did have trouble with one of the Narnia stories, and Don King can correct me if I'm wrong, but The Magician's Nephew, I believe, took about 4 years. He started that, had to put it aside, but generally he did do it in pretty quick order, especially compared to Tolkien. If you consider the 4-year time period for The Magician's Nephew as the hardest one he had, that would have been a quick book for Tolkien to have only 4 years.
And I'll just kind of piggyback on that. I know many of you are probably interested in the Narnia stories. Lewis said that he had the idea for the first idea for the Narnia stories was a mental image that he had when he was about 16 years old, and it was a picture of a fawn in a snowy wood carrying packages. And many of you will know that's a very important image at the beginning of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. But then he said it wasn't until the 1940s that he decided to write a story about it. And then it wasn't until the 1950s that he actually wrote the stories. So those of you that have ideas, I know you're young, but maybe you're writing down various ideas. Don't throw those ideas away. You never know when that idea may come to fruition. Think about writing as sort of like a long cooking, simmering stew. You just don't know what's going to eventually bubble up out of that stew. Don't throw away ideas. Also, when you're invited, and I hope many of you will be and perhaps are being, when you're invited to write different kinds of things for different audiences, different publications, don't ever turn down an opportunity when somebody asks you to write something that's going to be published, no matter how seemingly insignificant it might be.
Let me follow up on your follow-up of me following up on William's follow-up of me. The business of capturing ideas. And you have ideas all the time. And you think, I'm going to do something with that. The problem is you forget the idea. You may remember that you had an idea, but you can't quite remember what the idea was.
That's just getting old. That's just getting old, pal.
Yeah, but now they've gotten old. They're not 10 anymore. And, you know, you're on the downhill slide now. But Lewis had a photographic memory. Some people do, I don't. Tolkien did not. And there's an interesting story Tolkien told about how he happened to write The Hobbit. Because, as I said, the whole idea of hobbits and the Lord of the Ring, that's just barely a footnote in his total Silmarillion, History of Middle-earth. It's a side story. And hobbits weren't a big part of the Silmarillion. They just were a passing phase. Remember I told you he had a professorship, so he didn't have to do all the drudgery work that Lewis did, but he needed money. He always needed money. He had children. He had expenses. And you could make extra money by grading examination papers. And he was grading an examination paper that came in a little booklet, a blue book. And he came to a blank page. And this idea came through his mind. He wrote it down. In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. And that's all there was. But he had that idea captured. And if you're serious about writing, somewhere about your person, have a piece of paper, a little pad, anything that you can capture ideas, because you never know when they're coming. Ideas come to me in the middle of a sermon. Lewis told his brother Warney one Sunday morning, a particularly dull sermon, I should say. He had this idea of a junior devil trying to get advice from a senior devil. And he captured that idea. I don't think he wrote it down, but he did write to his brother that he'd had that idea. This became the Screwtape Letters. And that's Lewis's mind. Most of the rest of us need to write it down. I've published 16 books. Every one of them is a collection of little slips of paper, backs of envelopes, sermon bulletins, cash register receipts, in which when the idea came, I wrote it down. And if you'll do that, you will never suffer writer's block. Because you don't think of what to write when you're sitting in front of the keyboard. What you write about comes to you at other times. But if you've got that little piece of paper at the keyboard, the whole idea will come rushing back to you. You just need one little phrase or sentence to capture the whole idea. So in terms of the most helpful writing advice I can give to you from my own experience is write it down.
Now, with the modern technology, of course, so anyone have a smartphone? One or two of you, maybe? Okay. You can also record, or if you have a smart watch, you can do that as well.
You can take a
are you
nail
into
and
that?
scratch it onto the screen of that, and you'll have it, yeah.
Well, speaking of advice, and we're very much aware that we're not going to go through all the questions here, so we'll kind of see how we go here. But I think the next one we had planned dovetails quite nicely, and that is advice that Lewis and Tolkien gave about writing. Lewis has quite a bit that you can find in the letters, but we'll have Don summarize some of that, and then I think Hal will come up with something that maybe Tolkien said here or there.
I refer you to a wonderful little book called Letters to Children. After the Chronicles of Narnia were written, Lewis began to receive letters from children. And then even after he died, he continued to get letters from children who asked him questions about the Narnia stories. Who was this character supposed to represent? What were you trying to do in this part of the story, and so forth? And some of the best advice that Lewis gives about writing is to those children as he responded to them. Among the things that he told the children was to try to write sentences that mean exactly what you want the audience to understand. Now, I've been teaching writing at Montreat College for over 40 years. If I could have a nickel for every time I wrote on a student's paper, write clearer, more concise sentences, I'd be a very rich person. So that'd be my first thing. Really try to write clear, concise, lucid sentences. Lewis also suggested to the children who wrote to them, don't use really big words when a smaller word will do. Don't say infinitely if what you really mean is very. He also said, don't overuse adjectives. He says, don't tell your audience that something is terrible. Make your audience feel to itself terrified. He said, when you use adjectives, you're really asking the audience to do the work for you as a writer. So those are just a few of the things.
Tolkien did not have the big audience that Lewis had that occasioned all of those letters Lewis had to write. You know, he was a celebrity from during World War II. He was on the radio, and his popular books, The Screwtape Letters and The Great Divorce, were being devoured, and they prompted lots of letters. Tolkien didn't have to do with that. He did not have fans until after 1954, when The Fellowship of the Ring was written, and then he became a celebrity. So we don't have that body of advice, but what you have is behavior, and the behavior of Tolkien, I think, gives good advice for writing. Whereas Lewis only had one friend when he was a child, his brother, only one friend when he was a teenager, Arthur Greaves. and really didn't have any friends until after he graduated from college. Tolkien had already begun to practice literary friendship in high school, this group that got together and told stories. And Tolkien was the one who pulled people together to read the Icelandic tales. And Tolkien was the one who wanted to get together with Lewis every Monday morning to talk about what they were working on. And then it was Tolkien who helped Lewis really form this group called the Inklings, that group of literary people who met once a week for several decades, and they would critique one another's work. So Tolkien is the one who practiced the behavior of seeking out good criticism, not people who tear you down, but people who can give you good advice. So the idea of seeking a reasonable response to the writing you're doing, a second set of eyes to look at what you're working on, and cultivate a tough enough skin to be able to accept and receive constructive criticism. That's a difficult thing to do.
Yeah, I think another way we could look at the two writers is that both of them practiced something that I think is very important, particularly if you're writing fiction. Show rather than tell. Don't tell your audience what you want them to understand. Create the story in such a way as that you're showing them what it is you want them to feel.
And there ends the main part of the discussion specific to Lewis and Tolkien and what we might learn from them as writers. As noted at the start, there was actually a general introduction to Lewis and Tolkien at the beginning of that live presentation. I include it now because while it covers familiar ground for most of you, there were some specific comments about writing made during it that could be of interest to you. One thing to note as well is that at the beginning, Dr. King does mention a handout he passed out. I have a link in my show notes to an online resource that you can reference, but you can easily follow along without either.
I think you may have a handout that gives you a listing of Lewis's writings in chronological order. I won't spend any time going through that, but I hope you'll take a look at that. We might refer to it at some point. Just a quick overview of Lewis's life. He was born Clive Staples Lewis in November of 1898 in Belfast, so he was an Irishman. He was born into a loving family. He had a brother 3 years older, Warren. His father, Albert, was a court solicitor, a lawyer. His mother, Flora, was a brilliant woman, one of the first women to graduate from Queen's University. Lewis had, as I said, something of an idyllic life, at least early on. His childhood was quite blessed. But tragically, his mother died when he was 10 years old. And that kind of started him on a spiral of a loss of faith. He went off to a series of boarding schools in England, and for him, they were quite miserable. Eventually, he was relieved from that, and he studied under a tutor who had a great influence on his life. Lewis served in World War I in the trenches in France. He was wounded, could have easily been killed. By the way, Hal may refer to this, Tolkien also fought during World War I. Lewis returned to his studies after the war in Oxford. Eventually, he earned 3 degrees at Oxford, graduating at the highest possible level with those 3 degrees, so he was quite brilliant. He began teaching at one of the Oxford colleges, Magdalen College, in 1925. And through that time, say from the time right before he went off to World War I, through about the end of the 1920s, Lewis would have referred to himself as a blaspheming atheist. But something happened towards the end of the 20s, including an important friendship with Tolkien that Hal will talk about, that caused Lewis to undergo a Christian conversion. Up until that point, and you can look at this in your handout, up until that point, Lewis had tried to be a poet. His first 2 volumes of published work were volumes of poetry. I bet many of you have never even read a poem by C.S. Lewis, but that's what he wanted to be. He realized, however, that he would never be a great poet. He continued to write poetry throughout his life, But about the time he died to the idol of being a great poet, that's about the time he underwent a Christian conversion. And it was from that point onward, again, from about early 1930s onward, that I think Lewis's pen was sort of released and the ink flowed incredibly. Look especially at the 1940s. Look at how many books Lewis wrote during the 1940s. It's amazing. And he was a lecturer there at Oxford, so writing was sort of something that he did on the side. He remained at Oxford until the mid-50s. Unbelievably, Oxford never made C.S. Lewis a full professor. And in the mid-1950s, through the influence in part of Tolkien, Cambridge University basically stole Lewis away from Oxford because they created a special professorship for Lewis. He had the chair of medieval and Renaissance literature. So he left Oxford, he went to Cambridge, and he spent the last 8 or 9 years of his life at Cambridge. He also had an incredible relationship with a woman, Joy Davidman. There's been several films made of that. I could spend all of our time today talking about that relationship. But I'll stop and just note that Lewis died the same day that John F. Kennedy was assassinated. Hal, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, it's interesting that two of the most famous English writers of the 20th century were not English. As Don said, Lewis was Irish, came from Ireland, and Tolkien was South African. At least that's where he was born. He experienced some of the same tragedy that Lewis experienced in his childhood. Both of his parents died while he was a boy. His guardian was a Roman Catholic priest. Tolkien never wandered away from the faith the way Lewis did. If anything, he grew stronger in it. An important part of his life was, in his development, was what we would call his high school years in Birmingham at King Edward's School. There he had a little group of 4 friends who formed a bit of a club. It was a literary group. They liked to read, they liked to write, they liked to talk about what they were interested in. And this was when he developed his interest in writing. So you were at exactly the right age to be thinking seriously about your writing and practicing it. You just practice and think of every writing project is practice for honing your skill as a writer. He went off to Oxford University. He had a scholarship there. So, though he did not have the means himself, he at least had the ability to get his education. And he completed his college degree right on the verge of the beginning of the Great War. The Great War, the war to win all wars, after which there would never be any more wars, World War I. A devastating war. 20 million people were killed in the war, and it had a huge scar on Europeans that never really went away. It was the prelude to the Second World War. So he had that background of having seen violence, and so when he writes of battles in The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion and The Hobbit, he knows what a battle is. He spent time in hospital towards the end of the war, and while he was in the hospital, he began writing what became his stories of Middle-earth. First, he had to create Middle-earth, and he was beginning to get this idea in his mind. Now, the idea of Middle-earth comes from his earlier interest in Norse mythology. And in Norse mythology, there's Asgard, which is the heavenly realm, Nibelheim, which is the underworld, and Midgard, Middle-earth, which is between the two. And we live in Middle-earth. So he borrowed that from the old mythologies. At the end of the war, he was doing this, that, and the other to keep body and soul together. He had a girlfriend from his childhood. And they married after the war. He had his credentials. He was going to be a teacher at college. Didn't get to go to Oxford as a teacher immediately. He worked on the Oxford English Dictionary. He had a brief appointment at another school, but then he was brought back to Oxford as a professor. Now, Don mentioned that Lewis was never a professor at Oxford. Now, at Montreat College, everybody who teaches is a professor of some sort. And it's the difference between the American system and the British system. In the United States, when you're hired to teach, you're an assistant professor. And after a few years, if you don't spill hot coffee on the dean, you get to be an associate professor. And if you just hang around long enough and don't upset the trustees, you're promoted to full professor. But the title professor is rarely used in a British school. There are very few professors. And a person who is a professor normally has an appointment that has been endowed. That is, someone gave a large gift of money, and the salary is paid out of the proceeds of that gift of money. We've got a few of those in the United States. I have the Charles Colson Chair of Faith and Culture. So a gift in honor of Chuck Colson and Prison Fellowship pays my salary. Now, if you are a professor in Britain, you don't have to work as hard. Lewis was not a professor. He was a fellow. And essentially, he was an assistant professor his whole time at Oxford. That meant he had to teach more. And teaching in Oxford involved meeting with a student 1 hour a week. And during that hour, the student would read a term paper that they had written. And in Oxford, you don't go to classes for your education. You meet with your professor. And the term lasts 8 weeks, and during those 8 weeks, you write 8 term papers. And so Lewis is going to sit in his chair like I am now and listen for an hour while a student reads a paper, and he'll do that all day long, 5 days a week, interacting with the student, saying, "Why on earth did you say that? Have you read this?" and critiquing. Well, Tolkien didn't have to do all of that because he was a professor, so he had more free time to write. And that had a huge difference in what he was able to do. Well, he had that professorship from about 1925 until 1945, and then he got a new professorship, a more prestigious professorship, a professorship that had a little more money that was attached to it, the Merton Professor of English Literature. He held that then for another decade or so, about 15 years, I guess. And again, that allowed him the leisure and the free time to write. His wife died before he did, and in retirement they had moved to Bournemouth, which is a seaside resort. But when she died, he moved back to Oxford and moved back to the college he'd been a part of, Merton College. And that's where he ended his days in 1973. I should say, we know him for The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. The Hobbit was published in the mid-30s. The Lord of the Rings was published in the mid-50s. And it took that long to get the new book, they called it the New Hobbit while he was writing it, to write the thing and to finally get it published. And those were two different ordeals, but both of them were ordeals that you need to be aware of as a writer. Writing is one task you need to master. Getting published is another task you need to master, and that's the business side of writing. And maybe we'll hint at that.
Let me follow up, Hal. Can you share with the audience the relationship that Lewis and Tolkien had with regard to the publication of The Hobbit in particular, and The Lord of the Rings as well.
Tolkien was instrumental in Lewis's conversion to Christianity. They had gotten to be friends through their common interest in Norse mythology. And Tolkien thought, oh, what can I do that'll be lots of fun? I know, I'll invite people round and we'll read Old Icelandic together until they learn how to read it. And so they were doing that for evenings. But then that little group shifted its emphasis, and a few others joined them. And what they were doing was meeting once a week to read one another's work, what they were writing at the time. And so Lewis read The Allegory of Love, which was his big technical scholarly book. And then he was writing his first science fiction book, Out of the Silent Planet. Tolkien was writing The Hobbit, and so he would read installments of that. And they would encourage one another to write and almost dare each other to publish. And that was the incentive to go on. Now, once The Hobbit was in print, the publisher wanted a sequel. It took off, and a nice little children's book, let's get a sequel. So he started the sequel and didn't have a name. And then World War II started. And he'd write a little bit and he'd stop, and he didn't know where the thing was going. He didn't know, he didn't have the plot figured out. He didn't know how it was going to end. He struggled with it. So he sort of, have you ever been writing and you hit a dead end or a stall spot and you just put it on the shelf and walk away from it? That's what he did. And Lewis kept pushing him back. He'd get that thing down and start working on it. And so he was an encourager. He was a goad in his side until he finally finished it. And there wasn't anything like it. If you went to the bookstore, there was no section for fantasy. There was no section for what it was called, and it didn't have a place in the library. And the publisher thought, well, golly, he's put all this work in. Maybe we have a bit of an obligation for this little idiosyncratic book. We'll publish part of it and see what happens, and we'll just have a short run. That means you just publish a few copies of it as what we do to support scholars, and we won't pay him anything. Instead of paying him, normally you get might get a little advance, and then they'll give you a 10% royalty. So whatever they sell, you get 10% of that. And they said, we'll do something clever. We'll promise him 50% of the profits instead, and we won't give him an advance. Well, it was the best-selling novel of the 20th century and still is. He made an absolute fortune because the publisher didn't realize what a gold mine that he had.
And one of the things, Lewis actually read The Hobbit, I'm not sure it was a total 5 years, but close to 5 years before it was ever published. Their friendship was that close. That's interesting to note. One other thing, and I'm essentially moderating if you guys haven't figured out, and welcome to those of you who are just coming in. We just got an overview, essentially, of Lewis and Tolkien as individuals. One of the things that you'll kind of notice, even though Tolkien did get quite a bit of money, that was later in life, it's not too common for writers to be able to live on the proceeds of their writings, unfortunately. But if you have a passion for what you write, you need to continue with that. And it's an added bonus if you are able to get some income out of that.
Make sure you have a day job.
Yeah, definitely. Keep that day job. I trust you found these remarks helpful. As mentioned at the start, all this came from something that happened just before the annual Inklings Fellowship Weekend Retreat that is held at Montreat College. It was a creative writing festival for high school students at Montreat College held just before that retreat. That event is led by Dr. Kimberly Engel Associate Professor of English at Montreat. This final segment is the end of the discussion I had with Drs. Don King and Hal Poe. Again, I'm William O'Flaherty. Hal mentioned the Screwtape Letters. Last year, I had published an enhanced study guide of the Screwtape Letters, and this is going to be really hard to remember, so you might... No, this won't be hard to remember. Since the letters are written to demons, a demon, or by a demon, it's simply called C.S. Lewis Goes to Hell. EssentialCSLewis.com is the main website, and then I have a podcast that's based off of that. I just started an occasional series called Why Read Lewis, so that's something that you can consider. And that's most of what I've really written. My main job is as actually a family counselor, so I don't do this stuff full-time teaching like these guys. But tell us a little bit about your presence or books.
In terms of the web, Don and I, for 16 years, have run a little organization called the Inklings Fellowship. We put on a retreat here at Montreat first weekend of April every year. But it's focused around Lewis Tolkien and their literary friends. We'll explore a different theme each year. We also do a triennial conference in Oxford, a week in Oxford in July every 3 years, and then an academic conference for professors every year. My writing as the Colson Professor of Faith and Culture, I'm interested in how the gospel intersects culture and how the gospel addresses the deep issues of culture. So I write on science and religion. I write on politics and art. I write on literature and films. For 10 years, I was the president of the Edgar Allan Poe Museum in Richmond and started and ran for 10 years the Poe Writers Conference, and have done several books on Poe and his spiritual journey, as well as Lewis and the Inklings. So those.
And you're a direct descendant of Poe, right?
My great-great-grandfather was Poe's cousin. There.
My writing has focused on C.S. Lewis and the two women who perhaps had the most influence on his life. So I've written 3 books on Lewis, 3 books on Joy Davidman, the woman he married, and 3 books on Ruth Pitter, a poet who influenced Lewis and his never-ending quest to be known as a poet.
Thank you all so much for being here. That was so informative. I really enjoyed that conversation. Thank you so much.
And thank you, my listener, for your interest in All About Jack, a podcast feature of EssentialCSLewis.com. I'm William O'Flaherty, and All About Jack is also part of the Theology Mix Podcast Network. Be sure to check the show notes for any links mentioned during the program. The show notes can be found either at EssentialCSLewis.com or allaboutjack.podbean.com. The Podbean location is where the podcast is most easily found and navigated. Again, that's allaboutjack.podbean.com. Podbean is spelled Podbean. The other location, EssentialCSLewis.com, highlights the most recent show on the main page and also has space dedicated to listing past shows and the notes for them. Additionally, you can find a variety of other material on Lewis at EssentialCSLewis.com, including a popular series that explores quotations attributed to him that may not be from him. When you visit my site, be sure to listen to other interviews and special podcasts on a variety of topics, mostly directly related to Lewis. And in case you didn't know, during the week I occasionally post previously released podcasts on my iTunes feed that you can also find at the Podbean address. If you don't know how to get to the show on iTunes, then be sure to check the show notes for a direct link to that. Again, those notes can be found either at EssentialCSLewis.com or allaboutjack.podbean.com. If you do visit me on iTunes, please consider rating my podcast as it can help others find it there. Finally, in case you haven't heard, I have a book called C.S. Lewis Goes to Hell, a companion and study guide to the Screwtape Letters. It is available online at Amazon. Paperback is $14.99. Buying the book is a great way to help support my podcast. You can learn more about my book by visiting ScrewTapeCompanion.com. There you can get an immediate download of a free 20-page PDF sample of the book. Again, that's ScrewTapeCompanion.com. Thanks again for listening to All About Jack.